Dr. Edward Bork for agreeing to do his presentation today on opportunities to achieve grassland conservation through EG&S. Ed, whenever you're ready, go ahead.
Okay, thank you, John. Thank you for the invite. And thank you to Ian for hooking me up through technology. So hopefully everything kind of runs smoothly this morning. So I guess not being able to see anyone, I'll just keep going along, assuming that everything's running smoothly. So as John was saying, basically, I'm going to talk a little bit about what I perceive anyways are the opportunities to achieve grassland conservation through EG&S. Okay, so these are the major themes that I guess I want to touch on. First of all, provide a bit of an overview of the status of grasslands in Western Canada. So where are we in terms of the area that remains, and how is it spatially distributed across the region? I want to talk a little bit about the importance of grassland EG&S, including defining them. And I think maybe that's obvious to the folks that are online, but I think it's important to make sure that we're all thinking about the same components that comprise EG&S. And then also talk about some of the factors that are altering grassland EG&S, since those, usually from a land use disturbance regime aspect, those are the things that we are capable of potentially altering and thereby influencing the extent to which these EG&Ss are either maintained or potentially at risk of being lost. And so I think that'll also be an important component. And then I want to talk a little bit about the challenges of measuring and validating EG&S, especially in a heterogeneous environment such as our grasslands. And then I'll finish up with a discussion on some approaches and opportunities that we might take in order to help maintain or maybe even increase EG&S from our grasslands. Okay, so current status of Canadian grasslands. A lot of people are surprised to realize, and it's probably not a surprise to people that are online, but grasslands are actually considered one of the world's most endangered terrestrial ecosystems. If you look globally, upwards of 90% of grasslands have been lost in many regions. And in Western Canada, this pattern is also apparent, where we've lost roughly 3/4 of the grasslands, at least the native grasslands. Decline specifically in Alberta maybe aren't quite as large. They're somewhere around 60%. So about 4 of the roughly 10 million hectares that was once there still remains. And most of that is on Crown land. I think that's important because it means that on private land that there's this ongoing pressure to convert that land over into some other land use, usually cultivated crop production of some form. And then if we look regionally, we see that there's a lot of variation in terms of the declines in grasslands. And so here's an example of 4 different regions in Alberta, and it shows that we've lost roughly 82% across Western Canada, but even in Alberta, we see very widespread variation. For example, the driest part of Alberta, the dry mixed grass in the southeastern portion, we've lost roughly 2/3. Depending on moisture regime. The drier areas, of course, as I said, are more likely to remain intact. But if we look at the Foothills Fescue in southwestern Alberta, we've lost about 3/4 of those areas. And if we look at the Parkland, which is where I'm located, there's such a shift towards urban industrial development and also annual crop production that we've lost at least 85%. And I think that's a conservative estimate of loss. It's probably more likely to be 90 or 95%, with a very small fraction of that remaining in high health or good range condition. And even in the Rocky Mountain Forest Reserve, where we don't think about maybe land use conversion as being a big pressure, we've still seen as much as a 58% loss in grasslands. And that's due to very different pressures, such as expansion of woody plant communities and conifer encroachment because of an altered disturbance regime. So all of these are pressures that are ongoing within our grasslands. So it raises the question, why should society care about grassland decline? And of course, we're concerned, but we all usually have greater skin in the game than your typical member of the Canadian public. And I think that's the audience that we really need to reach out to. And so if we're going to try to convince them about the importance of grasslands and EG&S, we need to be clear in defining what those are. And so the way I define them are physical, functional, and socioeconomic benefits to society from the existence of grasslands. And so that includes, traditional goods and services like forage production and livestock production. And in fact, the roots of my profession in rangeland management is actually born out of forage and livestock production. However, grasslands provide much, much more than that. These are important areas for wildlife habitat, including species at risk. These are very significant areas of both floral and faunal biodiversity and habitat. They provide very sizable populations of pollinators, and I'll give you some examples of that later on in my talk. And then also these are very important areas for carbon storage and therefore greenhouse gas mitigation. And if we think even broader in terms of watersheds, there's water purification and flood mitigation. So all of these, and this is not an exhaustive list of any means, are important ecosystem goods and services that benefit everyone, every Canadian that's out there. And so that's what I think we really need to convince folks, that these areas are not just kind of relegated wastelands, which I think many Canadians, when they're driving around the countryside, may have that perception, and that's not the case. We can also break down the types of EG&Ss that are at risk within these grasslands into different types of services. So most of us are very familiar with provisioning services. So that would be the beef and forage production. And that, of course, would influence people that are trying to make a livelihood from these areas, such as ranchers, but also consumers of that beef, but also harvestable wildlife. So if you happen to be a hunter and you're interested in harvesting an antelope or a mule deer or an elk, many of those animals are actually being supported by these same areas. And then there's a much broader group of supporting services that everyone benefits from. That would include the biodiversity, species at risk, things like water cycling and management. And so that's that flood mitigation. But it also influences things like nutrient cycling and retention. So grasslands, by basically minimizing runoff, by having continuous cover, are able to minimize leakage of nutrients into adjacent water bodies and so on. So that's an important supporting service. And then there's that pollination. Regulating services would include things like climate modulation, greenhouse gas mitigation that we're doing a lot of work on at the U of A. And then there's that water storage and flood mitigation. And the last one that's probably overlooked, these are cultural services, which would include things like ecotourism, but also spiritualistic things and so on. So there's a lot of different EG&Ss that I think are at risk. And yet most of our traditional research is focusing in on, the provisioning services and with a much greater emphasis on beef and forage. And it's only more recently that we've started to look at those other supporting services and regulating services in much more detail. Okay, so let's just review some of these. In terms of beef production, I'm very familiar with the context in Alberta, where grasslands provide much of the forage for 1.6 million breeding beef cattle, and they contribute more than $3 billion in primary sales to the economy. And when you look at the multiplier effect, the effect to the overall economy is more than $10 billion. And a lot of people are very surprised to find out that the beef sector actually is a larger component of the agricultural economic sector in Alberta than, for example, the canola industry or than the wheat industry. And that surprises a lot of people. So this is a very important component of the Alberta economy and therefore the Canadian economy that is really intricately linked to these grasslands. There's, of course, the biodiversity. And biodiversity would include not only species at risk, it would include the consumptive wildlife species that I was mentioning, but also the structural diversity, the gamma diversity. There's many levels of diversity. And a lot of the diversity that we're starting to work on now are things that maybe are more obscure forms of diversity, such as microphytes on the soil surface, or even microbial diversity in the soil, and try to understand how that might affect different ecosystem goods and services, such as carbon storage, methane uptake, and so on. So when we think of biodiversity, we almost always think of birds, or we think of large mammals, but we don't think of the the more nuanced aspects of diversity. And those are all important as well. And then kind of to further this thought, I just want to talk a little bit about some of the pollinator work that one of my colleagues is doing, Cameron Carlisle. Pollinators support more than 80% of food crops globally. And until recently, we really didn't understand a whole lot about the pollinators in grasslands here in Western Canada. Well, he's had work now ongoing for about 5 to 6 years. And some of that work is showing more than 140 different bee species within Alberta grasslands, for example. And another interesting thing is they've done some comparisons between fields that are in canola, so monoculture cropping, and adjacent intact rangeland or grasslands. And they found that particularly in the mixed grass, those intact, diverse, floristically diverse grasslands actually support much higher bee abundance. So again, when we think about pollinators under decline globally, grasslands are a very important component of the long-term survival of those pollinators, and that could have spillover effects on our food supply and so on. The flood mitigation issue is, again, one that I think a lot of people don't really think about. Grasslands are a major vehicle to help capture, store, and then slowly release water. And of course, that's important for users downstream that might need that water, but also helps mitigate the impact of short-term flood events. So we all remember the flood that happened in Calgary in 2013. And I'm not saying that grasslands or grassland management could have, overwhelmingly prevented those floods. That's not the case. But whatever we're doing upstream of those flood events certainly has an impact. And so in many parts of the world, we're often starting to think about grasslands as how do we manage those in order to influence positively the downstream hydrologic conditions so we don't incur those significant flood events, or even maintaining better water quality downstream. These are all important. On the ag side, the production side, I think a lot of our wetlands are often overlooked. Many of our cattle producers just see them as, well, they're there in the landscape and they know they're important for providing forage, but they underestimate typically how important they are. We've done some work at Kinsella that really highlights just how important these wetlands are. For example, in many of these regions, wetlands comprise only 4% of the landscape, but they generate twice the forage yield of what the adjacent uplands do. So they're not providing 4% of the forage, they're providing 8% of the biomass. And then when you look at forage quality, they often are actually providing much higher crude protein and crude protein yield through the May, June, and July periods, which means now they're no longer providing 8% of the forage, they're providing 10 or 11 or 12% of that forage. And perhaps most importantly, if those producers do run into a drought, those wetlands are incredibly important for providing emergency forage. So late in the year when everything else is drying up. And so these are some of the grossly underestimated and undervalued EG&Ss that are provided by wetlands and the linkage back to grasslands. Carbon storage, I mentioned, this is an area that we've been working a lot on. So grasslands cover roughly a quarter of the globe, but they also store anywhere between 10 and 30% of the world's organic carbon. And this is one of the large pools of carbon that can potentially offset the rising CO2 levels in the atmosphere. The temperate grasslands that we have in Western Canada, a much smaller area, they're about 8% of the Earth's surface, but they contain roughly 300 gigatons of carbon. A gigaton, to put it into scale, is 1 billion tons of carbon. So 1 billion ton, that's a gigaton. And the key thing is the vast majority of the carbon in these grasslands is below the soil surface. So it's in the root systems, and most importantly, it's in the soil organic matter. So it's in that organic carbon pool, upwards of 97%. So I just want to talk a little bit about the carbon work that we're doing, because I think it does have an important role to play. And we've certainly done a lot more work than what I'm presenting here. This is kind of a high-level overview. I just want to kind of impart on all of you how large the carbon stocks are within our grasslands. So we've had a study going on in conjunction with Alberta Environment and Parks since 2012, where we've looked at over 100 sites across Alberta, and we've looked at the size of the carbon pools, if you like. Now, we didn't go very deep in the soil. We only went down to 30 centimeters. So this is by no means capturing all of the carbon. But when we look at the size of the carbon stock, it's quite astounding that even in the dry mixed grass, we're looking at roughly 70 to 80 tons per hectare of carbon. So that's a pretty sizable stock of carbon. And if we look at the moister grasslands, say the Foothills Fescue, we're up over 100 or 120 ton. And if we look at the wettest environments, the upper foothills, we're pushing 180 tons of carbon. Now, remember, these are conservative estimates because we're not looking at carbon below 30 centimeters. And we know that there's a lot more carbon below there even. And what a lot of people are surprised about is that these values are actually comparable to what we find in the boreal forest, where much of the carbon is above ground, and even in rainforest. So again, it doesn't look like these grasslands are very productive or contain a lot of carbon, but they actually do. Another important feature of our grasslands is because you don't see that carbon above ground, because it's instead below ground, it means it's more protected and therefore more stable in the short term. And the point I'm trying to make here is if we're dealing with a boreal forest, for example, or the rainforest in the Amazon, if we get a fire event coming through, that carbon is released and it basically goes back into the atmosphere through combustion, and it contributes directly to rising CO2 levels. The thing about soil organic carbon, which is so high in our grasslands, is that that tends to be more stable over time. It's not that it can't change, but it tends to be more resistant to at least short-term disturbances like wildfire. And so that's a really important characteristic of that carbon that, again, is grossly undervalued at this point in time. Okay, so let's transition a little bit to talking about factors impacting grassland EG&Ss. So the big one is really land use conversion. So anytime we pave an area over, or we could convert it into roads or parking lots or whatever the case is, strip malls, that's basically directly reducing the area that's vegetated. And of course, that's going to impact habitat. It's going to impact carbon sequestration, all of those things, runoff. So that's the number one thing. But the other one that maybe is more pervasive over a larger land area is agricultural repurposing. So if we take grassland, perennial grassland, convert it over into cropland, that's going to have a direct impact. And the other one is within existing grasslands, if we alter the disturbance regime. So overgrazing is one that it may be occurring, but it's probably really quite sporadic at this point. It's generally less common. And the reason for that is, for example, because we know a lot more about grassland ecology, grassland carrying capacity, the limitations of grasslands. And so we've actually been reducing the stocking rates quite widely, including on public land. They're only a fraction of what they were at one time in the past. Some of the ones that are increasing are ones like recreational activities. If you look at southwestern Alberta and the Rocky Mountain Forest Reserve, it's not uncommon to find random camping and OHV activity that's actually having the biggest impact on grassland sustainability. And so that's an area that the government is certainly very well aware of, and we're going to have to do a lot more as our population continues to grow to figure out how to manage those areas. Another one is either severe fire or lack of fire. And both of these can actually be problematic. So one of the first research projects I worked on was the Granum fire in southwestern Alberta, which was a very catastrophic event. And it followed many, many years of fire suppression. And on and off over the last several decades, there's been quite a few of these fires. There's a recent one a couple of years ago, a couple of them actually in southeastern Alberta that we're also doing some research on. And again, because these fires are increasing in prevalence, it's becoming more important to understand what impact are they having on all kinds of EG&Ss. And another one is lack of fire. So much of that shrub encroachment I was telling you about earlier in the Rocky Mountain Forest Reserve, where we've lost 58% of grasslands, is due to long-term fire suppression. So again, the grasslands are under threat there because we've removed fire for too long a period of time. The urban industrial sprawl is happening. It's certainly quite catastrophic where it does occur. One of the best examples I have is a research site that one of my former PhD students, now Dr. Stephen Tanis, he had a study site north of Cochrane. And actually midstream in the middle of his research trial, his plot was actually purchased by a ranchette owner, and a house was promptly built on there, and it now looks like the picture that you see in the lower right panel. So, that's direct loss of those grasslands, and therefore direct reduction in all the EG&Ss associated with it. And we might think that grassland loss has ended in Western Canada, but that's not the case. There's quite a few examples of this. For example, this is a map by Joe Piboar from Saskatchewan showing grassland change from 1990 to 2015, and we see roughly 1.3 million hectares of native grassland lost during this time. So it is continuing, albeit on a slower basis. And while there's some expansion of new grassland, that's usually due to basically conversion of forest into some kind of introduced grassland. And I'm not saying those introduced grasslands don't have value, they certainly do, but they're not the same kind of grassland, and they're not the same in terms of the biodiversity that they're supporting. And of course, that parallels significant changes in biodiversity, such as the large-scale loss of or decline in grassland bird abundance since 1970. You can see that value of 69%. So one of the ones I want to really talk a lot about is how does cultivation alter carbon? Because cultivation is such a widespread land use activity now across most of Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and very large areas in Alberta as well, especially in the more fertile regions. So one of the interesting things about cultivation, we're taking a perennial system and we're replacing it with an annual, so a monoculture cropping regime. And what we do know is this leads to very significant reductions in carbon storage. So studies worldwide basically are all consistent in showing that we lose anywhere from a third up to as much as half or more of the grassland soil carbon stock. And so, there's two causes for this. One is the direct erosion, but the more likely effect is what Walter Wilms many years ago coined the furnace effect. And I really like the analogy. It's because of the fact we're removing the cover, we're creating a warmer soil, we're adding oxygen because we're cultivating it, and that really allows the microbes to work much more quickly and aggressively, and so they basically break down the carbon that's within there. And so the result is that you basically get this burning off, it's microbial burning off, not combustion directly, of that carbon, and it contributes to rising CO2. And upwards of 20% of the rise in atmospheric CO2 is actually due to land use conversion, not just burning of fossil fuels. And so if we look at how large these carbon losses are, they're very substantive. So this is an example from the Foothills Fescue, where they took native prairie and they converted it either into some tame forage, either smooth brome, orchard grass, or alfalfa, in which case you can see there was a reduction of about 20% in carbon concentration, and where they converted it to continuous wheat, so a monoculture cropping system, they actually lost upwards of a third, so 30% reduction. And so this is an important pattern that it's also repeated in the dry mixed grass, where we see even larger declines. I didn't show that example, but we do see that there as well. And then we had another set of sites where we actually, this is part of our benchmarking study again, we've actually quantified the same reductions. In the Prairie region, we see about a 28% decline in carbon stock. And in the Parkland region, we're seeing as much as a 45% reduction. So almost half of our carbon has been lost. Part of this is in the vegetation component, the litter and the mulch, but the majority of this is in the top 30 centimeters of mineral soil. So obviously land use conversion should be one of the big things that we're trying to avoid if we're trying to maintain carbon levels. And there is some good evidence to really indicate that there's a lot of value associated with the carbon losses that we're seeing across these regions. So this is a back of the envelope calculation that I like to use. So we took our benchmarking data and the data associated with this known land use conversion patterns using ABMI data. So that's Alberta Biodiversity Monitoring Institute data for land use change. We looked at the amount of carbon that we're losing, and then we attached a carbon valuation of $30 per ton of CO2 equivalent. And so that $30 per ton is basically the tax that the Alberta government imposes on large emitters for exceeding their targets. So there's actually a value out there that we know in the marketplace for it. And if we look at the carbon that's currently retained within our prairie and parkland systems, it's somewhere around $8 billion within each of those zones. So one way of looking at that carbon is if we were to cultivate all the rest of the native prairie in Alberta, that would be the value of the carbon that would be lost down the road. So that's the carbon that's potentially at risk through future land use conversion. The carbon previously lost is on the right side, and that's carbon that's already been lost because we've made the decision to convert those lands. And those numbers are even more mind-boggling, particularly in the parkland, where most of the land base has been converted. The value of that carbon is well over $20 billion. Now, there's big confidence intervals on here. Don't quote any of these numbers. But the point I'm trying to make is there's a lot of value in that carbon, and there's a lot at stake, both in terms of what we've already lost and what could be at risk if we continue to undergo future land use change. Another question that often comes up is how quickly does carbon recover once it's been lost? So if we cultivate a native prairie and it undergoes this large 30, 40, 50% reduction in carbon, and we put it back into native prairie, does it come back? And the reality is, yes, it starts to come back, but it's very, very slow. And that means this low resilience that we see, or this low recoverability that we see, suggests there's a very long-term opportunity cost associated with conversion of these lands and carbon release. So it's not like we can just flip the switch, reseed these areas, and we get the carbon back. It doesn't happen that quickly. And so I think that has implications for how we as a society should be looking at the value of that carbon. Some other work that we're doing, we're trying to understand the effect of specialized grazing systems on soil carbon. And there's a lot of conflicting literature on this. Some studies suggest grazing increases carbon. Other studies say no change. Other studies say, yeah, it goes down. We did a study with these many sites across Alberta that suggests that soil carbon concentration may actually increase by as much as 12% in the topsoil, so within the top 6 inches of soil. And this increase is most likely to occur in the highest rainfall grasslands, so the most productive grasslands of Alberta. And so that's a positive sign that grazing is at least compatible with maintaining and maybe even in some cases increasing carbon. We also have a study looking at the relationship between ongoing cattle management practices and biodiversity. So this is a study that involved the ABMI sites, which I referred to earlier, the Alberta Biodiversity Monitoring sites, where we went out and basically collected management level information on the grazing practices that go on at each of those sites and then linked it back to the biodiversity metrics that have been collected by the ABMI program. And one of the interesting things that's popping out of that is when we look at, for example, multi-diversity indices. So multi-diversity is looking at not just one group of taxa, and not just birds, for example, or not just insects, or not just, it's looking at all of these different levels of diversity. There may actually be a positive relationship between, for example, stocking rate and multi-diversity, at least up to a moderate level. And so again, this is kind of affirmation that grazing is maybe at least compatible with maintaining and in some cases even increasing diversity of these ecosystems. And that's not to say that we can't overgraze these systems, because we can. It's just to say that grazing is certainly compatible with maintaining biodiversity. And that's maybe not surprising because these grasslands evolved with millions of bison grazing on them for many years. So it's not that grazing needs to be removed to protect these systems. It's really a question of how should we graze in order to maintain them. Going back to some of Cameron Carlisle's work again, he's actually done some work looking at the relationship between bee abundance and bee richness, and also range health scores. So range health scores are basically this aggregate measure of how well these plant communities are faring in terms of their plant composition, their structure, their site stability, their ability to maintain hydrologic function, and so on. And they found positive relationships between both bee abundance and richness and range health scores. So again, from a management implication perspective, if we can maintain healthy grasslands by modifying our grazing appropriately, we're more likely to aid pollinators. And again, that's an important EG&S that all of society should be concerned about. So I want to transition at this point to talking about some of the challenges of measuring and really recording and figuring out what's going on in terms of our EG&S. The biggest problem that we have is that these grasslands are inevitably highly, highly heterogeneous. So when you look at them spatially, there's a lot of variability across the landscape, across the landform. It's due to variation in soil texture, moisture availability, other microsite conditions, and so on. That makes the quantification of these EG&Ss very, very difficult. It's not like looking at a cultivated patch of ground that's typically homogenized by inputs and cultivation and so on. And so any policies where we're trying to, let's say, reward producers for EG&Ss on a given tract of ground, we need to show how large those EG&Ss are and whether we've increased them, and measurement becomes critical. Now, it may be possible that improvements in technology, such as remote sensing, and maybe even the application of drone technology, that might offer some solutions, but quite honestly, we're not there yet to the point where we can rigorously say and reliably say we can quantify in real time what's going on with these EG&Ss. That's going to be a major challenge that we have. In terms of future information needs, one of the things is we're going to have to understand the trade-offs that occur. So if you have multiple land uses going on a particular landscape, or if you just have one land use that's going on, let's say grazing, you may see increases in one EGS, but some other ones go down. So there's going to be an optimization function in there. And some of those EG&Ss might trump all the other ones. For example, species at risk on public land, that is going to be the case. Whereas if you're talking about private land, then you get into these complex situations. Is it more important to manage for carbon storage, or is it more important to manage for forage? Well, if carbon is valued at a level higher than forage, that might be the primary management mandate on a given tract of land. And to get there, we really need to understand the economic benefits, which really reflects the willingness to pay of society and consumers for those as of yet unquantified EG&Ss. That includes the regulating and the supporting services. So the ones that don't fall into forage or livestock or wildlife directly, it includes those less tangible ones that we know are out there, but maybe we don't have a good handle on. And at this point, land managers and grassland managers are not being rewarded for. So thinking outside the box, what are some of the approaches that we could take, and how would that translate into opportunities? Well, one of the things that I would suggest we need to do as a society is we need to re-examine our thinking of how we actually assess EG&S. So, for instance, we need to place greater value on what is there right now, rather than looking at restoring what we've actually lost in the past. And this is really very similar to the bird in hand analogy. So if we're storing X amount of carbon in grasslands that are still under perennial cover, and yet that's at risk of being lost, I would say it's more important to incentivize producers to maintain and conserve that carbon than it is to try to go to landowners that have already cultivated their land, have lost that carbon, and to put some of that carbon back. And so in the process, we really need to de-emphasize additionality, for example, in valuing EG&Ss. So additionality is where we're only willing to pay for something if it's new EG&Ss rather than existing EG&Ss. And that's a major paradigm shift that we're not there yet. In terms of the marketplace, I used to have high hope that the regulated marketplace would be the way that we would go. So it would be driven by strong policy leadership. I don't think that's necessarily going to happen. I think the non-regulated or voluntary market, so things like grass finished beef, consumers demanding alternative production practices and paying a premium for grass finished beef, that's probably where it's going to come from. Or thinking really outside the box is EG&S markets that as of yet we've totally untapped. So things like fee access hunting. This is a steep hill to climb, because it will mean a significant paradigm shift in how society views wildlife. And again, we're not there yet, and yet other places in the world like Australia and the US and Africa and Europe are all there already. And it is helping them in their protection of EG&Ss. Some important approaches and opportunities, again, important to not lose sight of the big picture when understanding land use impacts. So one way of maybe thinking about the past impact of land use conversion is that maybe we need to think about areas that have already hemorrhaged EG&Ss, so areas that have undergone urban industrial development or even conversion to cropland in the past. Maybe we should be thinking of a taxable structure, and I'm not sure what that would look like, to transfer dollars to land managers that are actually maintaining or maybe increasing those EG&Ss. So this represents a radical shift. And living on out in the agricultural land base east of Edmonton, this is probably not a popular thing among some of my neighbors, but this is the reality that when you look at the big picture, that there's been significant lost EG&Ss, and yet there's no penalty being incurred for those changes. So one option might be to impose a surtax on urban industrial and cropland and reallocate those dollars. It may not come in the next year or 2 or 5 years, but I think in the long run, I wouldn't be surprised to see us going there. And no matter what we do, we're going to have a much greater education and awareness campaign. So that's of consumers, the lay public, which is our greatest ally if we can bring them on side, landowners, policymakers. And so I think there's a number of things that need to be done. For example, landowners, grassland managers, have the opportunity to reimagine their businesses, to rethink what their revenue streams will look like. The livestock industry should consider EG&Ss as not solely not solely as a social license to operate, which is, I think, one of the ways that they've been looking at this, but rather as a whole new way of expanding their business model. And that's important because if you now have an incentive to maintain EG&Ss, you're going to directly manage for them. They're not going to be a sideline. They're going to be a direct part of your business model. And so that's a really, really important outcome here. And so with that, I just want to thank some of the funding agencies that have supported our work. There's lots and lots of different people, many grad students and many other PIs have contributed to different aspects of this work. Also want to recognize Jody Best, who contributed some of the wonderful photos that are in this presentation. And so with that, I guess we open it up to questions. Is that correct, John?
Yeah, well, we can yeah, definitely. Thanks, Ed. That was great. And Ian, do you want to do the moderating for the questions?
Sure, I can certainly do that. If anybody does have a question, just raise your hand or type your name into the chat box, and I'll let Ed know that there's a question.
Maybe I hit them with information overload.
Maybe. I'd like to take this time to thank Ed for his presentation today, and thank everybody for joining us. And please stay tuned. We all have another webinar coming your way in April. Hey, Stuart, you can go ahead and ask your question.
Okay, yeah, I saw that I noticed that the POR map that says the grassland losses in Saskatchewan from 1990 to 2015. So I was just curious, what's the status of that report? Is that something that's readily available? Because I didn't see a citation on it and didn't know if it was just sort of something in-house or where that was.
I believe it's I believe it's an in-house report that was prepared for I can't remember whether it was Saskatchewan Ag or what. If you send me an email note, I can try to track it down for you and actually find the site that I found it from and direct it on. Yeah, that's the POR map, right? That you're referring to?
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. So what do you think are some of the biggest roadblocks to some of the changes that you've proposed and how we can conserve ecosystem services in grasslands? Like, what are some of the biggest challenges there, roadblocks and such?
Well, I tried to review some of those. So I think the biggest one is to make sure that everyone fully understands the magnitude of the EGNSs that are actually being provided by these areas. And so, and there are many, many examples of this. So, for example, the carbon storage. People are blown away when I show them the data and I say, well, actually, our grasslands, those arid areas that people don't think too much about, store as much carbon as the boreal forest. And they go, how can that be? That's impossible. And I go, yeah, that is the case. Here's another snippet that surprises a lot of people, and the media has now caught on to this. So we're also doing work looking at methane uptake, for example. So the cattle industry is often villainized for producing methane as part of, enteric methane production from digestion of fibrous forages. But what a lot of people also don't realize that healthy grassland soils are also a sink for methane. So there are microbes in a soil that basically consume methane. They metabolize methane over time. And so even though you have ruminants, and so bison would do the same thing, cattle would do the same, they're producing a certain amount of methane. There's also methanotrophs in the soil that are consuming some of that methane. And so to do a full accounting, you need to then understand, well, how much methane is being taken up by these grassland soils and how large is that sink? And so a big part of this is making sure that A, the science is there, but also B, that the full story is really getting out to everyone. And of course, a lot of ag producers are very interested in it because they're thinking of, well, how could this translate into new economic revenue for them? But we need to reach everybody, all members of the public. And so that's one really, really big part of this, that everyone needs to be on board, because once the social pressure is there, then it'll be more likely that we will get these markets, and we'll get also greater policy leadership that promotes these things. The other thing that really frustrates me, I talked about the additionality, and there's something called the additionality roadblock, that if something's already being provided for free, we're not willing to pay for it. And yet that puts all those services at great risk, because especially on private land, when private landowners are trying to make decisions on how are they going to manage their landscape, are they going to look at land use conversion, they take all the available information that's given to them. But if they're providing species at risk, if they're providing carbon storage, greenhouse gas uptake, and biodiversity, wildlife habitat, songbird richness, and so on, they're providing all those things for free, including consumptive wildlife. That's not going to factor into the equation when they start to make management decisions. And so the argument I make is, wait a minute, those are the areas that are at greatest risk because they're already providing a very large suite of environmental goods and services. And so we should be doing everything we can to incentivize those producers not to undergo further land use conversion. But that requires getting over this additionality roadblock. We don't want to pay for something. And when I say we, I mean, the Canadian government and provincial government. We don't want to pay for something that's already being provided for free. But when you do that, you continue to lose these EGNSs through ongoing land use conversion. That's the problem. So Stuart, did I answer your question?
Yeah, that was great. Thank you. Appreciate that.
All right. If anybody does have additional questions, you can certainly forward the questions to myself or John, and we'll definitely pass them on to Ed. Ed, again, thank you for your presentation today, and thank you for everybody for joining us, and we'll see you at our next webinar. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.